You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Sanja Haas. I'm the Human Capital Center leader at the Conference Board in Europe. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Inspiring People, Inspiring Journeys, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. In each episode, I sit down with another C-suite executive, and together we have a conversation around what helped them transition into their current role, tips for navigating the complex and demanding career landscape of today, and what they consider are the key ingredients for success both in their current role and in their previous roles. Today, I will be sitting down with Anne Stevens. She's the Council Director for the Global CHRO Council, HR Execs, and Global Women Business Leaders for the Conference Board. And Anne is also the former Vice President, People and Organization for Rio Tinto. We will discuss her professional journey, which we hope will help our listeners gain better insights into what is needed or not to have a fulfilling business and HR career journey. A very warm welcome to you, Anne. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So let me start by asking you, when did you leave Rio Tinto and what made you join the Conference Board?
Well, thank you, Sanja. It's great to be here. I finished with Rio Tinto early in 2015, actually. I'd been there for 6.5 years, having previously been a European director for IBM. And in terms of being associated with the Conference Board, I was actually a member of the Global HR Council from 2012. So I knew the Conference Board well, was always impressed by the professionalism, the vast amounts of research and insights, and also that I could share so much of that resource with my peers at Rio Tinto, as well as my team members. And when I left Rio Tinto, because I was obviously familiar with the Conference Board, I had an idea about a Global Women Business Leaders Forum based on my own experience. And really, it just took off, the relationship took off from there.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to talk a bit more about, what you're encountering today in your role as a council director, especially with CHROs and their career journeys. But let's just stay for a moment on your previous role and dial back the time a bit. If you could just tell the listeners a bit, what was it like in your last role to be a vice president?
Well, I think there were several challenges. I think the key thing is I moved from IBM, which is a high tech, highly organised, very process driven, very compliant organisation, to a mining organisation, which was at the time a loosely coupled federation of autonomous business units. So it was a very different environment. I think the other thing to recognise is I was brand new to mining, so I knew nothing about the industry. It was a brand new role that I stepped in, so it was very important for me to build trust and key relationships at all levels within the business. And also, I think being a non-miner, if you like, so coming completely from outside of the industry, I had quite a lot to prove. So I spent the first 6 months of my journey with Rio Tinto literally getting out to the businesses, going underground in the mines, getting up in the big trucks, talking to the local community liaison representatives to really understand the business as well as I possibly could and build those strong relationships, which actually proved to be a very good investment in time.
Wonderful. And if we just stay a bit on your professional journey and dial back even a bit more, I guess I'm very curious to hear, were you always in HR? How was your journey leading up to the Rio Tinto role? And are there some key milestones or memorable moments that you can share with the audience on top of what you just shared?
Well, gosh, actually, my career started in finance.
Oh,
So
wow.
no, so
Okay.
I've not always been in HR. I
Yeah.
actually started in taxation, and then
Oh,
moved through to accountancy, and I joined IBM in the finance area actually, and at that time, whilst I was, quite enjoying the role, IBM was growing very quickly and there were lots of opportunities. And
yeah.
I was very attracted to what was then called personnel, before we, of course, used the term human resources. So one of the key milestones, I guess, for me was moving from finance into what was then personnel and recognizing that I had, I think, a particular passion and something to add. Another key thing was being spotted by a senior technical manager in IBM.
Mm.
And which helped me, I think, understand that I could step out of what was then personnel into line management, which I did. And then I obviously later in my career moved from tech to mining. So I guess the key message there is never be afraid to step out of your comfort zone and take a few risks. I was a people manager, as I mentioned, then a second line people manager, and then I became a director in IBM. And so I think the key things really for me are being able to, if you like, take a bit of risk and be open to change, be flexible and be adaptable. In
Yeah.
terms of memorable moments, there was one particular moment where I had a very, very tough boss, somebody who came along from outside of the organisation, didn't really get to know me or the work I was doing, but made an opinion about me very quickly, and decided that the work I was doing probably wasn't as important as the financial side of the business. However, after about 18 months, he left the business again and wrote me a very interesting letter. It went along the lines of something like, "Anne, I was completely wrong about you. I hadn't understood the type of work you were doing. I hadn't realised how important leadership, culture, and people were to our business, and I now understand that." So it was a really interesting milestone for me and a significant moment in my career for sure.
Interesting, really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Anne, because there is clearly a moment of introspection of your manager as well as he was leaving. But it's a very interesting situation whereby if a line manager doesn't really understand the work, how it can go either one way or the other. So that's a great memorable moment. And then once you left Rio Tinto, was it hard to leave? Because clearly, since day one, you've been in the day-to-day operational business world. Was it hard to leave? And how did you transition into your current role as, among other things, council director for the conference board?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that timing is everything.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes you just know when the time is right to move on from your current role. As it happened, our business was reconfiguring. And so it was a great opportunity for me to plan my exit in a very considered way, make sure that it was a really good handover done, made sure that everybody was very comfortable with the transition before I actually left the business. But I think the other thing is that you've got to recognise things don't always go to plan. So it's important to stay flexible and adaptable, and also be open to things that are unexpected. I had some potential roles already lined up, and I knew I didn't want to go into a corporate role, so I already had some non-executive work lined up, and in fact, I was already a member of a charity board, and so that made the transition easier. I think the key thing I would say though is I found it quite or relatively straightforward to make that transition because I had been very close to the business that I was working in. I'd been very close to key stakeholders, and that helped me network tremendously as I stepped out of Rio Tinto. So I think if you can establish yourself as a business leader, not just an HR leader, it does open many doors for you, for sure.
Yes, yes, and that'll be a bit of the topic of the next couple of questions. But before we go on, I just want to say that there's clearly a red thread there in your journey up until now in terms of, as you said, timing is everything, and you also said that it's very important to be able to step out of your comfort zone and just change and go into the unexpected. So yeah. Very, very important point. And your point about being close to the business, and now again, comparing it, looking back at your role, your experiences, comparing it to present day, what you both hear in your councils, but in general, um, do you think that CHRO today is the same or different or very much different from when you were working in the business?
I think it's changed a lot, and I think it's
Mm,
for the better, by the way. I mean, if you just look at the
good.
last few years, and I don't want to keep harping on about the last few years, but it's very relevant, I think. The pandemic was a people crisis. There's no question about that. Now, the economic crisis, the energy crisis, the whole focus on sustainability and environmental, social, and governance goals that we all have, it's really brought HR to the forefront of the business. And as I said earlier, I think it's very important as an HR leader to establish yourself as a business leader first.
Yes.
And then, of course, have the focus on the people, the culture, the leadership, the environment you want to create, looking after the talent of the business. So I think it has changed. I think it's pushed the role of the CHRO and the whole function much further forward to the top table, and it's a much more strategic role now than it probably was, say, 10 years ago. And I think that will continue to evolve as we become more and more conscious of the need to have good people and the need to make sure that our employees are feeling as valued and as respected as they possibly can be.
Yeah. No, absolutely agree, and great to hear from you really on how you've seen the role evolve for the better, and also the whole function, not just the top role. So that's really encouraging to hear. Now, so in your opinion, what are organizations doing, and what do organizations have to do more of to help HR leaders transition to senior executive roles in HR today?
Well, for me, some of this is about reputation and credibility within the business, but also outside of your own business in your industry. So I think, HR functions, talking more generally, have to find ways to develop HR professionals and HR leaders, develop those senior business skills.
Yeah.
And there are lots of ways to do that. I've seen lots of rotation. I can take my own career, for example. I was in personnel. I stepped into line management. I became a director. But during that time, I was in and out of people-related roles, not always in HR, but I always had an eye on the people agenda. But it gave me a lot more business insight. Similarly, switching industries, I learned so much moving from tech to mining, as you can imagine, very different industries. So
Mm.
this whole idea of getting business experience, projects, rotations, assignments, it's all about developing broader skills, but also getting exposure to other things that are going to help HR leaders move to the very top of the business. And there are some great examples around already. We have some CHROs of some of our of our biggest corporations, certainly in Europe, and I'm sure it's the same around the rest of the world, where people have stepped out of the HR leadership role and taken on a much broader business role, and have done it very successfully.
Yes, yes. No, that's again encouraging words. And as we think of the very young talent coming up the HR pipeline, any additional do's or don'ts? I mean, you've shared a lot now already from your journey and some of the key elements, but any particular do's or don'ts you would tell a very young talent in HR today?
Well, there's several things. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but I do think
Mm,
taking risks to broaden your own experience is really, really important. I
yes.
think one of the other things that helped me actually was that I got a mentor. In fact, I got more than one mentor. I got two mentors, not necessarily internal to your own business either. If you can get a mentor who's outside of your own organisation, who can really be neutral, act as a good sounding board, but also guide you in your early career, I think that's very valuable. I think the other thing that younger people, and I don't want to generalize, but the thing I've found with my mentees, I mean, I'm a mentor as well, is
Mm,
that they don't always like to ask for help. And one of the messages I always promote with my mentees is it's very important to be clear and tell people what it is you want to do. And don't just tell them once, tell them again and tell everybody.
yeah.
Because the more people that understand your aspirations, the more people that are sitting in talent reviews, looking at you from a career perspective, and those people, and more people that can talk on your behalf, the better that will be. So I guess the message is find your voice and
Yeah.
make sure you're very clear about where you want to go and seek help, and in particular, one or possibly two mentors if you can.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those tips with us, Anne. And the whole topic of mentor, being a mentor and a mentee, is so important. So it was really brilliant that you brought up that topic as well. Final set of questions. Looking ahead, if we start with the function, how do you envisage the future of the HR function, and what are some of the opportunities you see in, let's say, fast forward 5 to 10 years from now?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear, Sonia, that we talk about this a lot in the in the councils
Yeah.
that I work with. So, in the CHRO Council, the European HR Exec Council, and even in the Global Women Business Leaders Council, organisations are all looking towards the future model, the future structure, what sort of roles we're going to have, what skills we're going to have, and I think the recognition that the criticality of the people, culture, and leadership elements of a business is really going to shape the way that the HR function leads the business in a very different way.
Mm.
So the opportunity to influence, shape the strategy for the business, the future of the organization. I think the other thing to think about, and this is something again I've come across a lot in my career, is that as HR leaders and HR professionals, sometimes we get a bit impatient when we're trying to drive change. HR has always been seen as a change agent, but I guess one of the key things I would say, and this is something I've learned, and actually it came up in one of our meetings a few weeks ago, it's important to give an organisation time to digest change.
Mm.
So, as an HR professional, it's important to explore where the business is, educate the business, but don't lecture them. And sometimes you've got to trust your instincts, your judgment, your gut, if you like, in terms of how you can drive that change. Because I know, as from an HR perspective, HR is at the forefront of change, but we've got to recognise it does take a little bit of time, particularly given we've been through 2 or 3 very difficult years, and with the economic crisis we're facing, with inflation, with labour shortages, with supply chain issues, there will be more tough times ahead. So it's important, I think, that HR recognise that taking time to shift and move an organisation forward is very important, rather than trying to rush things through too quickly.
Yes. And as you said, we've been through a couple of, we're still in a couple of very challenging times. And I think that, there's a something distinctive that HR can bring to the table and to the party compared to candidates coming maybe from more traditional routes, such as finance and marketing, as a consequence both of COVID and what we're going through now, and as a consequence of the change that we're encountering in our own function. So, without it being a leading question, Anne, final question from my end: do you think we'll see more CEOs in the future coming from the HR pipeline just because of this distinctive experience that we're making today?
Well, it's already happening, of course. I can
Mm,
think of 2 or 3 examples where we have
really?
senior
Mm,
executives and CEOs that have stepped out of the HR space. However, they have never been just pure HR professionals. And I go back to my previous point. They have established themselves as business leaders, first and foremost,
yes.
with a focus on the HR and people agenda. And I think that's made a big difference. Inevitably, the recognition that the people element of a business is so critical going forward will certainly, I think, help that transition from senior HR and business leaders to CEO roles. And I think, being much more influential on the strategy, understanding the dynamics of the business much more closely is going to help anybody move into that more senior role. So I think it will carry on happening. As I say, there are some examples. I think everybody recognises that key components of strategy, apart from the commercials, you have to think about your culture. You have to think about your leaders and what you want your leaders to be, and you have to think about your people. So people, leaders with the right background, I think, could work very well in that CEO position.
Mm. Thank you, Anne. A really, really interesting conversation and a lot of very tangible, I think, tips both for our listeners and for the young talent coming up the HR pipeline. But before we end, I wanted to ask you any other final thoughts. I've asked a lot of questions, but anything that we haven't brought up that you'd still like to bring up?
Well, I guess there's so much more we could say, Sonia, and I know
Yeah.
obviously we haven't got all day, but I guess the key things, if I look back on my career, some of the things I've learned, if you like, certainly when I was perhaps more junior, I used to take things very personally. And now I
Mm,
realised that some of the decisions that was personally affronted by were actually business decisions, not personal decisions. So important to remember not to take things personally. I think the other thing is being authentic, and we use that word a lot, but actually being really real. And if I'm honest, that's probably been one of the secrets of my success. I've always been not terribly conformist, but always true to the business, but true to myself. So I think that's important.
yes.
Staying flexible, we've talked about that. So important. It's going to be even more important coming forward. And also being curious, not just about your own business, your own industry, what's happening elsewhere? What insights can you bring to your organisation from other industries, and other organisations? And of course, this whole emotional intelligence is quite important now. We're seeing a need in leaders for much more empathy, a much more human type of leadership. So, using that emotional intelligence to understand the impact that you're having on the people around you is very important. And then finally, I guess I would say, it's important to seek feedback, learn from what others tell you and how others see you, and also what you see in other leaders. If there are leaders that you admire, and that it's the sort of person or the sort of role model you want to follow, then understand what it is that you like about it, that you're impressed with, and try and work out how you actually develop those traits for yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. This was really interesting and, very insightful. I was very curious to hear about your journey, so I certainly learned a lot today. And I hope it helped our audience as well as they think about both their current and their future career journeys. Thank you so much, Anne.
My pleasure. Thank you, Sanja.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience who tuned in for this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our Inspiring People, Inspiring Journeys podcast series, or explore the entire catalog and podcast programming from the conference board on our website.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.